Welcome to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world. Follow the conversation using hashtag TFD News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times. Hello, and welcome back to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. We are a man down again this week, but that's okay because I am here with the wonderful Francis. Francis, how are you doing this week?
Oh, what a lovely intro. Yeah, no, I'm doing very well, but I'm a little bit tired, I will admit. I'm still sort of recovering from I had half the week off to celebrate my birthday, the big 2-5. Wow. But yeah, so I'm still recovering a little bit from that, but yeah, I'm very excited to be here today, and we got some good topics to be talking about.
I can promise you it's all downhill from here.
Oh, don't say that.
You hit 25 and your knees go,
Oh
your
dear.
back goes. It's all fun and games. But
All
no,
got that
well,
to
we
look
hope you
forward
had a
to.
very happy birthday, of course. But now you're back and we're ready to talk about fintech. So I mean, what are you talking about today? I feel like it's been it's sort of a standard week really for fintech. So what are you bringing to the table today?
So today I wanted to sort of take a cybersecurity approach to things. I feel like we haven't really spoken about cybersecurity all that much lately. And I saw this news from Monzo about its new security controls to combat rising fraud. And I thought it was really interesting. So I wanted to talk about that today.
Awesome. And I am going to be talking about Klarna's new partnership with Adobe Commerce to allow merchants to implement BNPL services into the things. But I mean, let's go to you first. I think you're right. We haven't spoken about cybersecurity for a while. We also haven't really spoken about Monzo for a while, actually. So I think let's kick it off with that.
Yeah, you're right. I feel like for probably like especially after the pandemic, we were always talking about Starling and Monzo in sort of and Revolut, I suppose, really all in the sort of same sentence, I guess. I don't know. But now it feels like you're right, Monzo have I don't want to say fallen to the wayside because I feel like that's the wrong way to say it. But anyway, the news this week is that the Monzo Bank has unveiled 3 new security controls to combat fraud as financial crime continues to rise across the country, affecting many banking customers. So there's been 3 new releases, 3 new security measures called known locations, trusted contacts, and secret QR codes, which will roll out in the coming weeks, which customers can opt into to provide an additional layer of protection when making large transfers or withdrawing savings. So before going into sort of the figures about fraud and crime in the UK recently, I thought I'd just quickly explain what each of these security controls is. So known locations enables users to specify trusted locations like home or work from where they can make large transactions. Transfers attempted outside of these locations will be blocked, adding a geographical safety net to financial activities. Trusted contacts lets users enlist a friend or family member using Monzo to verify the safety of transactions exceeding a certain limit. This social validation step provides an extra layer of scrutiny, potentially stopping fraudulent transactions before they occur. And then secret QR codes gives customers a unique QR code stored separately on another device or printed, which must be scanned in the Monzo app to approve significant transfers. This dual device requirement ensures that even if a phone is stolen, unauthorized transactions cannot proceed without the QR code. And the reason all this is so impactful is because the amount of fraud going through phones has increased so much that it now exceeds the amount of sort of fraud that we see with cash and credit cards. With the latest UK finance figures revealing victims lost 136.2 million to impersonation scams last year alone. So, yeah, these 3 new measures are going to be following up, from new controls that other new controls that Monzo launched. For example, Call Status, which tackles impersonation scams by letting customers check in at whether they're on the phone to a Monzo employee or not. And Monzo's Call Status tool has been used to report over 4,000 fraud attempts so far this year. So, essentially, what I wanted to talk about really is: do you think these are well overdue? Are these some measures that we've been expecting for some time? Do you think they're potentially a little bit too laborious, perhaps? Like, for example, the QR code scanning needing to go to a separate device for whatever reason. Like, do you think that, or is it actually a really good way to ensure better security for UK consumers?
So I think these are some really interesting features that Monzo is bringing out here. I mean, like you were saying, at the start, I feel like the big, battle of the challenger banks that we had a few years ago, sort of in the onset of COVID and afterwards, has really died down lately. And now kind of challenger banks just sort of, same old, same old. They're just really they've embedded themselves in the industry and they're doing very well. So I think having Monzo bring out these features kind of feels like they're having like a really big point of difference here, because I think these are very proactive features rather than reactive, which I think you can sort of say that some of the banks that we have at the moment in the UK are being more reactive to fraud than proactive. So I think having these security controls is really interesting and really leveraging the technology. And I think, I don't necessarily think this is more friction for a consumer. And I guess it is in some ways, but then when it comes to fighting fraud, I think the only way that you can fight fraud is via adding friction to consumers, because that is just unfortunately the only way to do it. Because if you make it too easy to make these big payments or make these big transactions, then that's when you can start getting the fraud and the nastiness slipping in. And I think some of it, so the one that sticks out to me is the secret QR code, for two reasons. Number one, I love QR codes. I've talked about this before. I just think QR codes are brilliant. And number two, I think it's actually very interesting. You say, obviously, is this going to be a more laborious thing for consumers? Because actually, looking into it, obviously, this you've given like a very top level, and we don't know the major details of it. But looking at this, it's not really any different to when like HSBC used to do those little remote controls that I can't remember what they were actually called, but they were little security devices that you had to use to create a security code in order to make a transaction on your bank. And you still have that now. You have a digital banking code and digital banking password that you can use to log on to online banking, things like that. But when I first got an online bank account, I had this little teeny tiny little like credit card size button thing that I had to make a code on. So it's kind of no different to that. It's no different to things. And I know I'm calling out HSBC because that's the only one I've got experience with, but I know other banks had similar devices and similar sort of methods in having these, banking security codes. So actually, I don't think it's any different. And I think, it's a very interesting concept. And I like the whole thought of, even if it's, your phone is stolen, you still can't have those unauthorized transactions in. And it's just really interesting. And I think even like the known locations and trusted contacts as well, I think it's adding layers of protection that no one else is doing. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of any other bank that's doing things like this right now. I mean, I'm sure there probably is, and I've just not think. I think Revolut actually has done a few different things in its event verification. But I think, yeah, that when it comes to keeping money safe for consumers, there's only so many things you can do. And adding in these sort of extra layers of protection that, yes, do add friction to consumers, I think is just the only way to go. And it's actually really interesting to see how this is going to go. Like, are these features going to be popular? Are they like mandatory, or are they optional? I don't know if you know that, Francis. Do you have to have them, or is it something you can opt
No, I
into?
think it said that at the start. It said that it's the customers can opt into it. So I think
Opt
it's
in,
an
yeah.
addition, like optional additional layer of
Hmm.
protection.
You know what? I like it. I think it's interesting. I think it's going to be interesting to see the uptake and see how they go, and whether that it is actually doing what it says it's going to do, and whether it does bring that peace of mind to customers. Want to definitely keep in mind, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think you're spot on with what you said earlier about that. In order to, really fight fraud, you do need to have some friction. You can't have as much as the industry seems to desire it. I don't think you can have a completely frictionless experience because that's just too susceptible to fraud, really. I think what I really like about these is that it's like we've just said there, is that they're optional. You don't need to apply for all three. You can apply to the ones that you think are more applicable to you. So, for example, somebody like a business person who goes abroad a lot, they wouldn't want to use the known locations one because they're going to need to be making transfers, in different places all the time. And having those transfers blocked would just be that is unneeded friction, right? But I feel like if you then had somebody that, would go with you on these trips and you thought, oh, I need to make a transfer, but or then you lose the card, but then whoever's trying to impersonate you thinks, oh, I can pretend to be this person, but your business partner is there saying, no, that's not the case. This isn't the person trying to make it. I mean, that is a very specific example, but I feel like that is where it could be quite beneficial.
Yeah, and I think actually thinking on sort of the same kind of line of thought there, the trusted contacts one actually is probably going to be very useful when it comes to maybe more vulnerable people. So I think, like people who, they get a call and they need to send money to pay for the building work or something that they've had done and it's all turns out to be a scam. For someone, who is of an age or maybe, slightly vulnerable in that way, that could be a really interesting one to help people stay independent, but also keep that layer of safety if they have a family member or a carer or a guardian or whatever, just keeping an eye out of things and making sure they're not sending money when they don't need to. So actually, I think you're right. There are a lot of like niche uses for these security controls and things that'll be very useful.
You could also argue that it would go the same way for, like children as well.
Mm.
Children perhaps being like tricked online. It's very easy for people or younger people to be unaware of. I mean, you always think that the younger generations are, so digitally savvy that they're not ever going to fall victim. That's just not true. They do, and I think this is a good way to also, at the end of the day, it is just an added layer of protection. Like, for example, it won't take long just to be like, yep, this is right, done, approved, done. um, but yeah, no, I think they are really, really cool measures to really and simple measures. They're not overly complicated. They all seem very accessible to everyone, really. Like you've just said there, like any person from any sort of generation would be able to use these. And yeah, I mean, I think I did see another challenger bank use something similar to the call status offering, which is where checking into the app to make sure that you're if you're on the phone to someone, you are actually on the phone to them. But also think that's an incredible tool, and the fact that it has managed to report over 4,000 fraud attempts just goes to show how effective it's really been in sort of almost a year now that it's been in place. So I think it is really, really effective, and hopefully that we'll see the same sort of uptake and results from these three new security controls as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess moving on then to my article, kind of very different to what we're talking about just now, but news from Klarna, obviously, who have joined forces with Adobe Commerce to enable merchants to easily implement Klarna's buy now, pay later services, as well as some other flexible payment options. So this is an interesting partnership, one of kind of many big news stories coming out of Klarna at the moment. They seem to be quite busy. When it comes to announcing new things. And I think this is an interesting one because Klarna is hoping that the partnership with Adobe will enable it to increase the number of payment options for consumers, but also make buying goods and services from these merchants more attractive, boosting profit margins. And so this one I wanted to talk about today because I feel like over the past couple of months or so, we have kind of talked about buy now pay later as perhaps a little bit more of a dying form. Not dying in the sense that it is not popular anymore, but more just it's not trending anymore. It had that really big boost a couple of years ago when it was first sort of breaking through the noise and it was so popular. And now it just kind of simmered down into sort of, and it's just gently bubbling along, keeping itself going. And so we've also talked about how Klarna is kind of moving into sort of the payment space rather than being known as the buy now pay later provider. It's looking into sort of payments and AI and all that good stuff over there. So I thought this was just a really interesting one to talk about, mainly because I think within the article it says about how Adobe Analytics data has found that consumers are continued to embrace buy now pay later for flexibility in managing their budgets, and actually it is really doing very well at the moment and still growing. So from January to April 2024, so that's this year, $25.9 billion of e-commerce spend was driven by now pay later was $25.9 billion of e-commerce spend was driven by buy now pay later, which is up 11.8% from the same period last year, and this is kind of just still growing. And I guess I wanted to talk about buy now pay later as a whole, and has it really just become an alternative payment method that has just sort of embedded itself within the industry, and people and consumers are just really enjoying it and really like using it, and they like having that option of the flexibility that buy now pay later can provide. And I guess we talk a lot about, excuse me, we talk a lot about like the education and the making sure that you're using buy now pay later in a way that works for you, rather than falling afoul of some of the negatives that buy now pay later can bring. And I guess what do we think the future of buy now pay later is gonna be? I guess that's my big question because Klarna's had some partnerships before. It's partnered with Sainsbury's. earlier this year to bring buy now pay later payment methods to online checkouts. And just generally, we're just seeing a lot of buy now pay later happening. So I guess, what do you think about it? What do you think of the sector? Are we going to see a more of a boost? Do you think? Are we ever going to go back to the levels it was a couple of years ago when it's all anyone, including us, could talk about?
Yes and no. I feel like it is just a part of the mainstream payment method, like a mainstream payment method now. I don't think it is there's any way that people can get rid of it. I think it's here to stay. And to be honest, I think if anything, it can only sort of go up from here. I think, it's so easily accessible and so easy to use. The amount of times that I've sort of thought to myself, well, if there's a Klarna payment option, then that just makes it even more attractive, because it's like, oh, I'll be able to pay for this in three, and I'll be able to. This thing that perhaps may not have been affordable otherwise suddenly becomes very affordable. What I found really interesting is that this is still focused on the BNPL offering that Klarna has, because in the past year or so, we've really seen Klarna sort of move away from being exclusively a BNPL platform, and it's now become this AI powered global payments network, which includes BNPL. But I think it's really interesting that despite, we recently, for example, Klarna parted ways with Klarna Checkout. I believe it was sold to another company, but it just goes to show that despite that, BNPL is still a massive part of the ethos, I suppose, and that it's going to continue to be that, to stay that way. And I think, I don't know if we'll ever get to sort of like the pandemic or post pandemic sort of boom that, like you said, it was all everyone ever spoke about. But at the same time, there's just no way that people aren't going to use it and sort of think of it in a sort of a valid way, which is very accessible and very usable. It just is at the end of the day. And it is a good alternative to credit and debit cards. So why wouldn't you want to use it? And the stat from the article that between January and April, that $25.9 billion of e-commerce has been spent, which is up 11.8% from last year. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw that again next year, like another rise, 11.8% rise, or 12% even. I know, 0.2%. It's a big percentage, but you know what I mean. I feel like it would not surprise me at all to sort of see that growth again.
Yeah, and I think, you've made some really good points there, and I think you're right in saying that kind of buy now pay later has really just embedded itself, and like, why wouldn't consumers use it? Because at the end of the day, it is really useful, and I guess we hear a lot of the doom and gloom about things like this, and especially with, the negatives of buy now pay later, in the same way that we hear a lot about the negatives of like credit cards and things like that. When I was younger, my parents told me like never get a credit card, even though that they can be very useful. And so I think that's kind of the same thing we're having with buy now pay later. I think everyone's very concerned about the negatives, but obviously there are a lot of positives still, and it's those positives that I guess keep the consumers going back. So at the end of the day, you may as well serve the consumers that you've got and that are there and are interested in your solutions, and wanting that greater flexibility and accessibility in their payment services. So it makes sense, and I think this partnership is going to be really interesting to see it continue to grow and break through, I guess. But anyway, that does bring us to the end of our discussion today. So thank you, Francis, for chatting with me. If you want to hear any more about anything we've talked about today, or anything else about the fintech world, head on over to thefintechtimes.com, where there's plenty more news and insights over there. And very quickly, we will move on to what I learned this week. So each week, we learn so much new information with all the insights and news stories crossing our desks here at the Fintech Times, that we thought it would be fun to share that with our listeners. So, Francis, what have you learned this week?
So this week I learned that Paxos, the regulated blockchain and tokenization infrastructure platform, is expanding into Singapore, as a result of the Monetary Authority of Singapore having finalized its stablecoin regulatory framework last year, yeah, and Paxos have now decided that the time is right for them to expand into the region to offer their stablecoin offering in Singapore.
Fantastic stuff. And what I learned this week is that the American FinTech Council is partnering with the Association of Military Banks of America in order to help financial support for military and veteran families. But that obviously is very interesting itself. But the thing that I did find interesting was that they are looking to work together to educate their collective memberships through podcasts and webinars, which I just thought was a really nice little thing, a nice detail, and something, it's nice to see people embracing sort of the digital world in terms of providing information. But anyway, thank you so much, Francis, for joining me this week. Hopefully next week we will have a full house again with Tom coming back. But for now, thank you so much, and I will catch you on the next one.
See you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Don't miss next week's episode, and continue the conversation using #TFT News and Views, and follow us at the Fintech Times.